Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Makers Forum. We're just going to wait a moment or two to give people time to filter in from the waiting room. So I'll just give it a minute. But it would be great if, as you join, you can rename yourself with your name and organisation. If you haven't done that already, you just click the three dots in the top right corner of your image. It's really lovely to be able to see who we've got. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Makers Forum. We're just, Tara, I think it's a bit of feedback from you. Don't worry, that's okay. Yeah, it'd be great if everybody can just pop themselves on mute while we wait for people to filter in. Okay, looks like we've got a good number of people in the room now, so I will get going. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the City Makers Forum. I'm Hannah Gibbs, Head of Knowledge at Future of London. And if you don't know us, we are an independent network for built environment practitioners. We provide leadership training, research, facilitation, and events that connect a diverse range of people on a really broad range of topical urban issues. City Makers Forum is a partnership with Hatch, who specialise in social and economic research on places, communities, and projects. And today's session is all about digital poverty and what we as city makers can do to address this. So many city makers are addressing smart city principles as a way of reducing digital poverty and equality, which are two of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in a drive to become Cities 4.0, which is a reference to the fourth industrial revolution, many cities are using big data, new technology, and citizen engagement to launch smart city projects and initiatives that do a wide range of things. They boost the economy, they enhance the natural environment, improve education, increase access to work and social mobility, and drive social innovation and build vital community connections. London is no different, adopting our first digital strategy in 2012. But with many indicators showing that inequalities are widening, and obviously the COVID pandemic highlighting the acuteness of this issue, we wanted to look at how the strategy is working. So we'll be looking a bit more about what Cities 4.0 means in greater depth. We'll have an international look at how other cities have adopted smart city principles to reduce inequalities. And we really hope that you kind of come away with an overview of the challenges we all face, as well as some ideas of what we can do to kind of play our role in addressing digital poverty and achieving digital inclusion. So today we're going to hear from a range of speakers. We have Daniel Miles from Hatch, Theo Blackwell from the GLA, Heather Yedigaroff from DG Cities, and Charlie Young from the Girls Network. A really great broad panel who are able to reflect on digital poverty from different scales and perspectives. So I think it's going to be a really rich discussion. Following their presentations, we'll move on to a Q&A session and a bit more of a discussion, and you'll have your opportunity to pose your questions to our wonderful panel. You can feel free to pop your questions in the chat at any time throughout the session. And if you're willing to come on camera when we get to that bit to ask your question in person, we really welcome that. We want it to kind of be as interactive as possible, but recognise not everybody is brave enough to do that. That's absolutely fine. Please say hi in the chat where you're from, and feel free to use it as an opportunity to share any resources or things that you'd like to share or think that the network could benefit from. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Daniel Miles, who is Director in Hatch's New York City office. And he's going to set the scene really for us and provide reflections on their recent international smart city research project. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Hannah. As Hannah said, I'm going to give a very high-level presentation of the results of a smart city study that Hatch was a sponsor of. And as you see from across the bottom of the screen, Hatch did this research in conjunction with a coalition of a who's who of smart city leaders. It's Deloitte, Cisco, Honeywell, Intel, Microsoft, Oracle, just to name a few. And what we were looking at in this part of the study was how smart innovation can drive urban resilience, sustainability, and citizen well-being, with the Sustainable Development Goals as kind of a framework that we use to kind of look at this. It was very interesting because this study was launched in February of 2020. So we kind of set off to do this study. We had the study all ready to go. And it was going to be focused on the SDGs, but then kind of late February, early March of 2020 hit. And so we kind of quickly pivoted. And so we kept the focus on the SDGs, but we also added a layer of the pandemic. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And so what we found was that COVID-19 was a stress test for cities, but at the same time, it was also a catalyst for change. And to kind of understand how COVID-19 impacted cities, we had a multi-pronged research approach. So we surveyed 167 cities across the globe. These were diverse populations and economies. We're interested to learn what they're doing in terms of the SDGs, how they use data, how they use technology, how they use citizen engagement to drive their progress. We created a sustainability index that I'll talk about in a minute. We gathered data from trusted sources for each of these 167 cities. We conducted interviews with urban leaders and experts. I think we ended up doing about 10 to 15 different case studies. And a lot of those case studies ended up coming back to talking about the issue of digital poverty and digital inequality. And we had a multidisciplinary advisory board that kind of helped guide the research. Next slide, please. And so what we did was we looked at kind of both the maturity of cities in achieving their sustainable development goals, but also their smart city maturity. So we came up with two different maturity curves for cities. One was looking at how much progress they made in achieving the sustainable development goals, and we categorized cities into implementers, advancers, and sprinters. And then we looked at how well cities are doing in terms of using data and technology and citizen engagement to drive their economic, social, and environmental goals. And what we did was we overlaid these two maturity curves, and we came up with this notion of the idea of cities 4.0. And this was kind of cities that are leaders in both the use of technology and smart cities, but also in achieving their sustainable development goals. And this provided a really interesting lens through which to look at some of this data. So we could really see how cities are using data and technology to drive their sustainability goals. Next slide, please. And so kind of just to give a little bit of background. So we asked cities about what are the top disruptions facing cities. And what we found was that by far, COVID was the biggest upheaval facing cities, which is not surprising because when we were in the field with this survey, it was at the very beginning of the pandemic. It was April, May of 2020. And across the globe, 81% of cities said it was the pandemic. But if we take a look at either North America, where it was 98% of cities said this, and in Europe, it was 92% of cities. So it seems like in some areas, they were feeling the pandemic more than others. And if you look at the next two disruptions, decline in economic growth and rising digital expectations, they're way behind the pandemic in terms of the disruption, but you could argue that they're both kind of related to the pandemic as well. And then if you go down and you look at some of the other disruptions, it's climate change, lack of resources, shifting demographics, and social unrest, which was a big one in the United States. Because again, when we were finishing up the field work, it was right around the time of the Black Lives Matter movement in North America. So we were able to catch some of that. And then it was also clear from our research that the pandemic is going to have lasting impacts on cities. Nearly 70% said their cities are going to reconsider how they use urban space. More than half are rethinking mobility. More than half are accelerating the shift to online healthcare, which is an issue if there's a lot of digital inequality in your city. Again, more than half permanently change how people live, work, and socialize, which requires digital connectivity for people to be able to participate. And almost 30% of cities said it exposed weaknesses in their digital infrastructure. Next slide, please. But it also highlighted the value of smart city programs. Nearly 2/3 of cities said that what they learned from the number one lesson they learned from the pandemic was that their smart city programs are crucial for their future. And more than half that they have to pay attention to citizen health. And it also showed the need for cities to provide more reliable and affordable internet, with 25% of cities citing that as one of the top 3 lessons learned from the pandemic. Next slide, please. We also looked at the challenges facing cities. And so as you see, I mean, it's a lot of what you would expect. It's complex policies and regulations, finding the right partner, data security and privacy. But then we also asked also in this list of challenges that we asked cities about was several topics around digital connectivity. And what we found was that for 15% of cities, they cited unequal access to digital connectivity as a challenge. And in the emerging market cities, high cost of digital connectivity was a challenge for 20% of cities compared to 6% for advanced. And limited digital infrastructure was a problem for 25% of the emerging market cities and only 4% of the advanced cities. So, I mean, it seems like a lot of this is an emerging market problem. But then if you look at kind of cities themselves, we did an interview with Barcelona, and what we found was Barcelona in January of 2021 did a survey of their citizens, and they found that 92% of citizens had digital connectivity. But when they really dug into that 8% that didn't, they found it was the vast majority of those people, and it was almost all of their citizens who were 75 and older who did not have any digital connectivity. And so that it was because of lack of resources, or it was lack of knowledge and education around how to access digital connectivity. But kind of just by looking at the big numbers, you can mask some of the impact in some of the more disadvantaged and marginalized communities. Next slide, please. We also asked across a number of different infrastructure types, we asked citizens or cities to rank the quality of their digital infrastructure. And what we found was that 75% of cities ranked it as good or very good. But as you see, there are stark differences when you look at advanced versus emerging markets, as well as in terms of size. It seems like the smaller the city, the better they think their digital infrastructure is. And when you get to the mega cities, they have some issues with regards to their digital infrastructure. And we also found what appears to be a correlation between the quality of digital infrastructure and cities' ability to achieve their sustainable development goals. So if you look at the difference between implementers, advancers, and sprinters, as you recall, sprinters are the ones who have made the most progress in their sustainable development goals, and 83% of those cities rank their digital infrastructure as good or very good. But if you look at implementers, those who are just beginning their journey, it's only 41% of cities that view their digital infrastructure as good or very good. So you see, there appears to be some level of correlation between a city's ability to achieve their sustainable development goals and their level of their quality of digital infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we also asked cities where they're investing across these 8 urban domains. And what we found out is that when cities are kind of beginning their sustainability journey, they're not really focusing on their digital infrastructure. It's one of the lowest. It is the lowest kind of area for their investment. But as they move from implementer to advancer, the digital infrastructure investments quickly pick up, and they're kind of ranked second in terms of areas of importance. And then by the time they become a sprinter, it's kind of on the upper end of where they're investing. Next slide, please. And then we also asked them how mature they are in using digital technologies to achieve across the urban domains. And what we found is that, again, when they're beginning their sustainable development goal journey, digital infrastructure isn't really that important to them. It's the second lowest area of their investment. But as they kind of move up the sustainable development curve, it becomes number one for advancers and number one for sprinters. So as they move up the curve, the importance of digital infrastructure becomes clear to cities. Next slide, please. And then so we asked cities, what kind of steps and solutions are they taking to help with regards to the digital infrastructure? And what we found is that one thing we learned is that closing the digital divide is a priority for most cities, and that some cities are better at others. For example, sprinters, nearly 2/3 provide free Wi-Fi or access to computer facilities, and 2/3 are using data and analytics to understand the digital divide, to understand where there are pockets of issues within their cities. It's equal. I mean, almost 50% of each type of city are partnering with telecom providers to provide smart city services, but sprinters are much better at non-sprinters at leveraging their city resources to provide the infrastructure to telecom companies to help install the infrastructure to close the divide. And they're also a little bit better at working with partners to provide free and low cost devices. This was one of the things that we found when we talked to people in the city of Philadelphia. They were trying to, the Smart City Office in the city of Philadelphia has been trying to get elected officials and foundations in Philadelphia to pay attention to the digital divide issue, where I don't know if you're familiar with Philadelphia or not, but it's one of the poorest big cities in the United States. And what they found was that when they looked at digital connectivity, 25% of the citizens didn't have digital connectivity. And it became a really big issue when the schools shut down as a result of the pandemic. So the city was forced to really kind of do a lot to try to close that gap. And what they ended up doing was partnering with Comcast, who's a big cable company who's also headquartered in Philadelphia. And they were able to provide free devices to the school students who didn't have access to a computer at home, to kind of help close that digital divide. Next slide, please. And we also asked them in terms of investments, what are they investing in and where are they seeing the biggest returns? And what we found is that for both sprinters and non-sprinters, they're really investing in public Wi-Fi networks, IoT, and cloud. And that public Wi-Fi is also generating the largest return for cities. And then the sprinters are also doing other things to help kind of close the digital divide. They're investing in a municipal broadband utility, where almost a third of cities are doing that. Or a third of sprinters are also investing in a public fiber optic network. So they're making investments to try to provide the infrastructure to help close the digital gap. All right, next slide. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
Brilliant. Daniel, thanks ever so much. That's great. I mean, it's amazing to get that insight from across all those cities. And I think to see how digital and data kind of is of varying levels of priority depending on where a city is with its, with the other kind of priorities going on. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I know that our network really loves to hear from the perspective from other places. So thanks. And yeah, do ask questions for Daniel, which we'll come to in the Q&A. And I just wanted to highlight that we will circulate the slides afterwards, so don't feel you have to absorb every single thing on first reading. Great, we're now going to go to Theo, who is Chief Digital Officer at the GLA. Theo is going to provide us with a London perspective and a bit of an overview of the capital's priorities, particularly in the context of recovery. So over to you, Theo.
Well, thanks, Hannah. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, Daniel. Really comprehensive study you did. And I'll enjoy recapping them, perhaps stealing some stats properly credited for future presentations. Now, so I'm going to talk about what we call digital access in London. But before I do, I'll probably say a couple of comments about smart cities. Because London sort of started its smart city journey really early on. And in fact, some of the things that are, really smart city technology aren't really seen as smart city technology by Londoners. So if you think about the congestion charge, which was implemented in 2003, so almost 20 years ago, that is effectively camera networks linked to a national database in order to achieve an objective, which is reducing congestion in London. I don't think, and certainly when I joined the GLA, we didn't really sort of put that in the smart city canon. The Oyster card is also a smart city technology, and that's led to the massive reduction in queues on the underground and allows people to get on trains quicker when the times were busier. Contactless payment, which Transport for London implemented on the underground, almost making the Oyster card legacy, is a smart city technology, and helped popularize contactless payment in other applications in your daily life, just because of the kind of mass rollout on the underground. And of course, as we go from congestion charge to ultra low emission zone, that's a smart city technology along the same principles. Transport for London's open data that frees up lots and lots of data about travel patterns enables an ecosystem of apps to people's phones to allow them to make transport choices and move around the city and plan better. So all of these things are kind of like embedded in our lives, but you know, they're not necessarily seen, I don't think, by Londoners as smart city applications. But when we talk about I suppose smart cities and digital transformation, there's sort of two buckets. One is a kind of existing generation of digitization. How do you get your services from platforms by the state or private sector? And then there's the future. And what I mean by the future are emerging technologies. So those technologies that are based upon the digital infrastructure that we are now seeing as deployed. So 5G, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things networks, those are a digital infrastructure that will create a new generation of services and applications that are far in advance of what we have now. So that would be immersive and extended reality, robotics. It will enable cities to do smart logistics, meaning we might be able to plan heavy freight movements around the city. So we'll have fewer of it, but it will be at capacity. What's called mobility services, so things like demand responsive public transport, buses, the autonomization of vehicles, drones for delivery. So all of those things kind of go in the emerging technology box. So, you know, as Daniel rightly said, during the crisis, we've sort of faced a real moment where everything had to be done online, or most everything had to be done online. So digital access and digital inclusion became much higher up the agenda, and it's remained there. So the mayor and London councils have come together, and this is the slide here, for a recovery mission for the city with a series of objectives, one of which is digital access for all. So it is now seen as one of the key components of what we need to do. And obviously, this is important for equity in the city, that people can't be left behind as more and more services have that online option or go online only. It's also important that we have something that brings things together for effectiveness, because one of the challenges with digital inclusion, certainly in the UK, is essentially over the last decade, it's the role of government has perhaps taken a backseat to the role of others in making people included. So that would be banks doing digital inclusion programs, telecoms firms doing digital inclusion programs. There are massive campaigns out there. And of course, local government has a role through libraries and lots and lots of initiatives that it does. But the landscape is very, very complicated to navigate. So if you looked across London, you would see a huge range of initiatives. You'd see a large body of evidence pointing to groups of people who are digitally excluded. But as we found during the crisis, those reports almost sit above addressing the need. So we know groups of people who are likely to be digitally excluded, but we don't know who is digitally excluded. Next slide, please. So over last year, we talked to Londoners about what they thought their priorities, our priorities should be on digital access. And they told us, and this is using both community engagement processes and also our online platform, Talk London, where we asked people directly and also people who had been helping people who were digitally excluded, what we should be focusing on. And they told us that we need to fix the plumbing. We need to make sure the basics were right and done well right across London. So that's improving full fibre connectivity, which London is it has a significant challenge over. About 20% of London is full fibre. Train people, so get people who've got basic digital skills, the skills they need. And for those who don't have a device, help them get a device or a dongle, get them connected on the internet if they can't afford it. So that's what Londoners told us. Next slide, please. So apologies for the sort of slight City Hall slide here, but so we've come up with a programme that, instead of doing what we did in the past, which was having a number of separate initiatives, we've joined them together in a mission around digital access. And ultimately, the aim of this mission is that everyone will be connected. But central to this is a digital access offer for Londoners. By bringing together best practice and linking programs, we hope to have a kind of minimum offer for Londoners that they can get the connectivity they need, that they have access to essential digital skills if they've got no skills whatsoever, and through an innovation program, which we're funding with the London Office of Technology, start to see digital access as a service rather than something that people find if they happen to be in an area where there is someone doing something here. So we're moving away from the idea that digital inclusion is, in a sense, a description you put on as a collection of initiatives from the state, corporate sector, and civil society, more to see this as a service. Someone presents themselves at a point of need, and the person supporting them, the librarian, the customer service person from the council, someone at a GP surgery, can easily signpost that person and triage them towards the help that's on offer. And what we need to do for that is have better data about who is excluded, not just groups of people, not just general areas in which they live, but actual people, so that we can do the proper outreach. So,
sorry, Theo, I'm going to have to hurry you. If you can just wrap up, that would be great.
In conclusion.
Thank you.
Yeah, it always happens like that. So we are linking a significant amount of investment in connectivity using our public assets to roll out full fibre, and that's led by Transport for London. Every adult over the age of 19 will be able to access basic digital skills from their local college, and we will use data and design to create that service so that we can move towards a more systematic approach to tackling this issue. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Theo. And I think thanks also for raising those things that we don't necessarily see as digital or data. I think we might kind of come back to that a bit in the discussion. Okay. Now over to Heather, who is Head of Strategy and Operations at DG Cities, and she's going to talk us through what's happening in Greenwich with regards to digital innovation. Go ahead, Heather.
Thanks, Hannah, and hi everyone. Really pleased to be here this afternoon. So definitely feeling that I've got two hard acts to follow there. So many thanks, Daniel and Theo, and also Hannah for the introduction. So first of all, just a brief explanation of who we are. So DG Cities is an innovation company owned by the Royal Borough of Greenwich. We were established in 2015 to develop and implement the council's smart city strategy and advance its work on urban innovation. So we don't just work in Greenwich, we're involved in a range of innovation projects in different locations. If you're interested in knowing more about that model or what we do, get in touch or check out our website. But for today, we're here to talk about digital poverty, and I'm going to talk about two of the projects that the company's involved in the borough. And I'm quite happy and relieved to say that I think the things that we're doing are very much in line with what you've just said, Theo, and also what you and your GLA colleagues heard when you went out to talk to Londoners about their needs. First slide, please, Eunice. Thank you. So just very briefly on the borough's digital strategy. So I'm not going to talk about this at length because this is very much owned and delivered by my council colleagues. But just to say that it's quite new. It was published at the end of last year and it covers the period 2020 to 24. We've got 6 key pillars, including the building of new services in a way that addresses digital inclusion, and another pillar is, for example, the more effective use of data. But the one thing I wanted to highlight is that our Greenwich digital strategy is absolutely underpinned by a commitment to working in the open. So if you're keen to know more, please get in touch with Kit, who heads up that area, or join one of the regular show and tells that are now happening across multiple areas of the council to showcase the implementation of that strategy. But next slide, please. Thank you. So again, not going to spend much time on this, don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but I just want to say that our view is obviously that in order to make an impact on local digital exclusion, you need to consider all of these different drivers. And a lack of access might not just be because of financial constraints, it might be because, as Theo has highlighted, there are problems with connectivity provision, and that's actually kind of a surprisingly big issue here in Greenwich. We do also, in common with, I'm sure, every other borough, have a substantial group of those who simply lack the confidence to get online. And just interesting little kind of snippet from one of our residents. She's in her 80s and she coined a phrase that we really like, which is digital frailty. And she coined that to describe her friend's level of skills and confidence. And she's one of our local champions, who I'll talk a bit more about in a second, who's trying to support elderly people to learn from younger people about how to use online tools safely. So just coming on to talk about a couple of our initiatives in the borough. So next slide, please. Thanks. So first of all, we have a digital inclusion programme that we've called Greenwich Get Digital, Learn and Learn, and it's a scheme around the lending of devices and upskilling of communities. So we're working with local Somali groups, the Nepalese community, and also disabled groups. We're working with 15 community centres across the borough and lending devices on a monthly basis. So tablets and laptops are available to be borrowed, being used for schoolwork, access to training and skills, and also to help the elderly learn how to safely bank and shop online. But a really big important element of this programme is about tackling the skills and confidence barriers. So we've complemented our lending scheme with a training programme that's got two different streams. So we're training hard to reach vulnerable groups in community centres, and we're also training via a digital champions programme whereby our Greenwich community champions, of whom there are about 200, are being trained to deliver basic skills to their communities. And this Train the Trainer programme is enabling us to sort of develop skills in some of the hardest to reach communities in Greenwich. Next slide, please. And the second initiative I want to touch on is our digital connectivity joint venture. And the reason we're doing this is because of the issues that I mentioned about the borough's sort of lack of high speed or reliable or even tolerable speed connectivity. And over the last few months, we've been in a procurement process for a joint venture partner. And once that process is finalised, we will be jointly investing in fibre to the premises infrastructure with that partner. We're initially going to be focusing on Woolwich in the east of the borough, and then subject to the success of that first phase, we're hoping to roll that programme out more widely. And really the whole intention of that programme is to make a substantial impact on the areas of the borough where that lack of access because of a lack of provision presents a barrier to digital inclusion. So next slide, please. So if we just go to the quote slide, thank you. Thanks, Eunice. So I just wanted to finish on this thought, which I'm happy to say again seems to be in line with some of Theo's thoughts. And that thought is that you really need to understand digital inclusion on both the macro and the micro scale. So whilst it's really useful, obviously, to track digital inclusion measures regionally, within a city like London, that macro data can hide the specific needs of different groups. And to get a full picture, you really have to get close to communities and close to people and understand their specific needs. And this quote that I've put here, this is actually from Kit Collingwood, who heads up our digital work. And she said this exact quote as part of the publication of our digital strategy. And I just wanted to include it because I think it really sort of nicely sums up our sort of view on this, and her reference to having a laser focus on people's needs, I think is absolutely hits the nail on the head. So thanks for listening, and thanks for having me here today, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Heather. That's brilliant. Really great to hear about some of the kind of personal experiences and the nuance, and about the sort of partnerships going on there. And yeah, always great to end on a quote as well. Brilliant. Just a reminder to the audience to pop your questions in the chat. We've got a few filtering through, but do add them so that we can come to you when we get to the question and answer shortly. So last but not least, we are going to Charlie, who's CEO and co-founder of the Girls Network, and she's going to talk to us about the charity's works to support young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. Go ahead, Charlie.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks so much for having me here. As Hannah said, I'm CEO and co-founder of the Girls Network, and we are a mentoring charity supporting 14 to 19-year-old girls from the least advantaged communities across England. We match them with a professional woman who acts as a mentor and connect them with a network of professional female role models to help them access opportunities they might not otherwise be able to access, to build confidence, to develop skills, and ultimately to be ambitious for their futures, whatever it is that they're passionate about, and support them to realise those. So we're working with about 1,400 girls across the country at the moment, and that includes almost 500 across London boroughs. And so I just want to share a little bit about our experience with working with these girls and young women, and particularly over the pandemic, but more widely as well. So over the pandemic, we moved all of our provision, our mentoring workshops online. And in some senses, that was amazing because it enabled girls to access things that they maybe otherwise couldn't do. And I think there's an extent to which this access and technology to digital services is really important in terms of being a leveller. It means that people that can't afford to travel perhaps can access opportunities, workshops, work experience that they otherwise couldn't. It also enabled young people to be creative and entrepreneurial, where they were trapped at home, couldn't get out. We saw many of our girls creating businesses online, setting up YouTube channels and using that as a way to also deal with some of the perhaps caring responsibilities they had. There was one girl we worked with who had to take care of her siblings, and as part of that set up a YouTube channel to engage them and use online technology to do so. So we know this can be a really exciting opportunity, but actually for a lot of the girls we work with, it increased the divide, not just in terms of accessing education and schoolwork, but actually these other opportunities that would help them to further their futures. So one of the challenges we saw was not always having good access to Wi-Fi or indeed the technology. For a lot of the girls, they maybe had a phone, often they didn't have a laptop that worked, or they were sharing with their siblings and their parents at home. So whilst there are great examples of companies, for example, we worked with one who opened up a school leaving programme, inviting our girls to take part, get a job at this trading company. They didn't need formal education. All they needed was good Wi-Fi. So in theory, a great opportunity, but actually many of our girls didn't have that. But it wasn't just the direct access to the technology, and I think that's something that's sort of been picked up about in terms of the more holistic picture. Actually, for many of the girls, they were living in small spaces and they were sharing spaces with siblings and parents working. And actually the ability to study or work remotely, to be able to use the technology to take part in work experience or to get a job or even just engage in schoolwork was a problem. For our mentoring, many of the girls ended up having to resort to phone calls, and even those were interrupted by siblings. So I think, that there's a bigger challenge there. There was also a challenge about being able to identify and make the most of the opportunities and the resources that are available. So a lot of our girls and families didn't know what was available to them. They didn't know where to find perhaps the opportunity to get free laptops or where to get the SIM cards that I think some phone companies were providing. So actually there's something about making sure that the opportunities we do have available are accessible and we're reaching the people that need them most and making sure they understand where to find them. And then I think the final thing that we understood was that we don't always understand why things aren't accessible. And this has been alluded to as well. And we can speculate and we can definitely use data to begin to understand it. But there's nothing better than having conversations with those people it's affecting. And so we spoke to our girls to understand what were the barriers. To some of them, it was not understanding online etiquette, for example, not knowing how to engage on a Zoom call, or as I said, not having a quiet space to work at home. So just briefly, the things that we've seen are working. Firstly, identifying who you aren't reaching and putting time and resource into finding them. So I think understanding, as Theo, I think, was referencing, understanding who those individuals are and getting to them. So not just expecting them to come and find you. And I think working with charities and organisations that are reaching the hardest to reach is a really good way of doing it. An example with the G7 summit, there was an organisation setting up a Y7 summit for young people to have their voices heard, and they wanted to make sure that that was reaching the young people that otherwise wouldn't have their voices heard. So working with charities like the Girls Network and others was a good way of getting to those girls and young people that wouldn't be heard otherwise. Another thing we heard from our girls is having more opportunities that are accessible via platforms they're using, and particularly that they're using on their phones. So for some of the girls who didn't have a laptop, actually, if there was an ability to engage something on their telephone, suddenly it was that much more accessible. Also, they talked about applications for jobs. Being able to submit a video application is far more accessible than perhaps having to fill a long online form. It's been referenced, but provision of technology and space. If there are places that young people can go to work where it is quieter and where they can borrow technology. But finally, also referenced is just making sure that we have the voice of girls and young women and those underrepresented people in decision making, in designing things, understanding what their experiences is. One of the things that we've done over this lockdown period was launch our girl-led mentoring, which was a kind of reverse mentoring, if you like, where some of our girls would mentor senior individuals in the Metropolitan Police. It was a pilot, and we'd love to see it grow beyond that. The idea was, though, that the girls were having their voices and their experiences heard by people that could make decisions and could change things in the system and society. And for us, that was a really powerful mechanism to make sure that we disrupted that flow of power, and actually the people whose voices weren't being heard were being heard by the people who could do something with them. So I'll stop there, just a brief summary of what we're doing, what we've been learning, but really excited to be involved in the discussion.
Thanks, Charlie. That's brilliant. And yeah, amazing to almost hear some of the kind of challenges at the beginning answered by the work that the Girls Network is doing. So yes, thank you to all of our speakers, all of our brilliant panel, for giving us such a great overview there. And, you know, we've heard about challenges, we've heard about some solutions and practical ideas, and it's just been brilliant to get that kind of international city, borough perspective, and then to hear about the experience of, you know, a group that we need to focus on, young women. So we're going to move to the discussion, and feel free to switch your cameras back on for this if you haven't already, so that we can kind of all join in. Post your questions, and yeah, if you are willing to ask your question on camera, you can either just raise your hand on Zoom or just say in the chat that you'd be happy to do that, and we will come to you. I will just ask one question to kick things off, and then we'll go to the audience questions. So I just wanted to ask the panel, based on the fact that lots of people in this room, and probably, you know, lots of our broader network, they're not digital experts necessarily. They don't have this as part of their core work or their job title. But, you know, we all have a role to play as city makers. So do you have any thoughts or reflections on what broader city makers can do to address digital divide? I'll maybe go to Theo first.
Well, one of the reasons why we've put this really high up the agenda is something needs to happen. There needs to be greater leadership on this, joining things up, and actually it sort of sits at a higher level in an organisation, as opposed to I suppose my challenges about how digital inclusion was addressed, especially in London, was that either people were kind of expected to be included over time because just society would advance and the number of people who were excluded would fall off, or there was an overestimation of the number of people who were digitally included. Okay, on paper, we've got a very high rates comparatively to the rest of the country. But I think there was a reticence to fully invest in really active policies. So we want to put this at the doors of leaders of councils, of chief executives, of leaders of colleges, and so on. And that I think is a step one in making a difference. Step two is to assist them with the structure that we're developing, saying this can be achieved. It's just you need to think about this, not in terms of resource, but effort, bring the right teams together. Too often these initiatives have just happened without any sense of joining up.
Yeah, and definitely something that we are constantly advocating for, about communication and collaboration. So yeah, you get our vote with that one. Daniel, any thoughts from you on kind of what broader city makers can do to have an impact in this area?
I think it's working to maintain the momentum. I think COVID-19 kind of got the ball rolling. This was especially in the city of Philadelphia, this is an issue that kind of small fringe groups have been working on, but now it's kind of really come to the forefront, and it's kind of keeping it there, keeping it at the forefront. And I think that's where kind of the broader community, the broader kind of policymakers come to play is you need to kind of keep this out there, keep this as an issue, because that's the only way it's going to get solved. It's not going to get solved on its own, because it's been trying to be solved on its own forever now, and it hasn't happened. So I think we need to kind of seize the day, seize the momentum, and keep it going. And I think that's where groups like Charlie's groups and Heather's groups kind of come in to they could help kind of keep it at the forefront. And I think that's what needs to be done.
Yeah, it's like so many issues that have been kind of brought to the forefront through COVID and now, Black Lives Matter. I think a lot of our network are feeling glad almost for the renewed focus on some of these things and the impetus it gives us to sort of concentrate on them. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to turn to Heather for a question from our audience. So Paul Simpson is asking why Royal Borough of Greenwich set up a company to do this work. So it'd be just interesting to hear about why that was set up specifically and why there was that need, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the reason the council set up the innovation company was purely because it recognised that there would be benefits from having an external company that sat slightly outside the council's, I suppose, structures and decision-making process. So by having the company, it just enables the council to work more flexibly, to work in a more agile way, to enter into partnerships that it might not be able to enter into, to take some risks, I suppose. So we're involved in quite a lot of research and development projects that are funded by central government, and they're definitely outside of the core business of the local authority. To develop new insights through doing those innovation projects. So I should just make clear that, responsibility for digital inclusion doesn't sit within the company. We're contributing or delivering projects that are relevant to this area. But it's not that the council's kind of outsourced this area of work to the company. There's a very large and sort of growing digital team in Greenwich who are kind of absolutely kind of at the forefront of this agenda, and we work in partnership alongside them.
Brilliant. I'm going to go to our Future of London's friend, Ollie Pinch, who's at London Borough of Barnet now, to ask his question. Go ahead, Ollie.
Thanks, Hannah. My question, I think, has already been partially addressed by some of the panel after I asked it, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more from everyone really about it. It's mostly about those that are harder to reach, so the groups that aren't necessarily self-selecting to get all the good stuff that Theo and Heather and others have talked about, the devices, the connections, the skills. How do we get to those people? How are they going to benefit from all this?
Maybe Charlie, do you want to give your reflections? And then if anyone else from the panel wants to, just make yourselves known to me.
Yeah, of course. I think the idea of community champions is a really good one. I think finding the people in communities that are listened to and are connected to the hardest to reach is helpful. I think understanding where those people are, spending time and going to them rather than expecting them to come to you is really important. We also find proactively working with our girls and telling them why it's important and telling them why their voice matters, and then providing them the training and the skills to be able to share their opinion and their experiences as well. And that's sometimes a challenge, actually. It can be quite a frightening thing, or you can feel like you're going to be ignored and not heard, so why bother? What's the point? So I think there's a kind of responsibility on us to make sure people are supported and listened to, and that is a positive experience, as well as proactively going to where they are and finding them.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Any other reflections from the rest of the panel?
Yeah, happy to say something here. So yeah, to echo Charlie, and I would say this because this is something we're doing, but I think the working with champions is extremely valuable. So that's something that we're doing in Greenwich, and we're finding that it's having an impact and it's helping us reach the people who we ordinarily wouldn't be able to reach. Like, one thing we've been reflecting on though in Greenwich and DG cities recently is that the council has a number of different champions initiatives. So we've got health champions, and those are the people that we're working with on that digital inclusion project. But when you talk to other council colleagues, you find out that there are waste champions, there are energy champions. So there's a lot of sort of siloed sort of champions initiatives, which, you know, in Greenwich at least, they're not currently joined up. So one of the things that we're really interested in is how can you try and sort of galvanise something bigger by joining up all of those different kind of motivations and different champions networks. So that's something that we definitely haven't got right yet, but we're kind of interested in spending a bit more time on.
Thanks, Heather. And yeah, I was just reflecting as well on the idea of whether some of the barriers that you talked about, you know, the older people that you've dealt with are kind of similar to those experienced by the young girls that Charlie's working with too. It's interesting to think that those very different groups might have some of the same experiences. Theo, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just for Ollie and anyone else there who's really committed to this from a provider level. The London Office of Technology and Innovation is being funded by City Hall to deliver the innovation program, to work up how we can think of digital access as a service. Currently talking to your colleagues in Barnet, but and across London. So please join in that conversation. So some really interesting work about personas, and based upon our experience of the pandemic, and really, really interesting work with data, including working with the private sector to model where digitally excluded people are by using some of their data too. So these kind of like quite important sort of innovations that we're getting into now, but they can only work if they have, you know, your lived experience and user lived experience.
Yeah, as with so many of our urban issues, it's, you know, it's coming down to listening and being open to kind of hearing from people and what their experiences are. Yeah, so absolutely. Okay, we've now got a question from our own Fran Lord, who's got a question for Daniel. Fran, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. Daniel, I was wondering if you had any examples that you could point to of specific cities that are doing digital inclusion really well already.
That's a great question. I mean, I think one that we found that has been able to kind of leverage some of their assets has been Stockholm. So Stockholm has this great, they installed years ago, they installed a fiber ring around the city that had all this latent dark fiber that they were then able to use to tap into, to provide, to work with the private sector to access this dark fiber, to be able to provide low cost internet in some of their poorer neighborhoods. And so I think I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but I think they have one of the highest kind of internet connectivity rates in the world. So I think that is one city that has done that very well. And there's a couple cities in the United States who have kind of are trying to follow that model. For example, I did some work with the city of Newark, which is right across the river from New Jersey. And they have a similar dark fiber network. But and so if you look at the data on the map as to kind of who has access to dark fiber, or who has access to high-speed internet, it looks like the whole city has access to high-speed internet. But when you really start to dig into it, yeah, it's on the pole. I mean, it's there, but it comes down to an affordability issue. So it's how do you leverage that asset that the city has to work with the private sector to be able to get them, to incentivize them to provide that kind of to provide that low cost internet connectivity that people need. So I think that, and then San Jose is a similar problem. It's in the Silicon Valley, so you would think it would be a very well connected city, but again, they have pockets that are kind of hard to reach, and they're trying to do a similar type of model with the kind of the municipal fiber network to leverage that to get the private sector to come in and to have access to that infrastructure and then provide kind of low cost internet access to people.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to hear that other places have the same challenges. And yeah, if I don't know if you've got any links to any of those cities that you just mentioned that you can pass on to people. And I know that you linked to the research earlier that people can dig into. That'd be great. Just on that, we're talking about sort of the partnership between, I guess, city authorities and the public sector. Be interested to hear thoughts from the rest of the panel, maybe Charlie first, about what opportunities there are for collaboration and cross-sector partnerships to address the digital divide and inequalities.
Looking for my mute button. Yeah, I think lots. I think in terms of working with organisations like mine, you know, we have access to the girls and the schools, their experiences, but also to be able to disseminate information about what is available to them. We're also working with lots of corporate organisations who are providing various employment opportunities, training opportunities for the girls and young women we work with, also some extending it to their families as well. I think there's something really important about utilising networks that already exist. So, you know, I was thinking earlier in terms of the harder to reach also, there are amazing networks of youth workers. So even when you have young people that aren't engaging with school and the formal education system, actually youth workers are really an untapped network. And there are networks of youth workers. There are networks of people that have their fingers in lots of different pies. And I think that's a really good way of reaching as well. But part of the problem is mapping out everything that's there, all the networks that are there in order to be able to connect to them. But I think there are amazing opportunities when you start to look and see what networks already exist and connect that then to those people that are offering opportunities, be they employment or training or resources, because often those offering the opportunities don't know how to get them to the people that they want to get them to. And it's that brokerage that can be challenging.
Great, yeah, thank you, Charlie. Theo and Heather, I don't know if either of you also have reflections on the opportunities for cross-sector collaboration to address digital inequality.
Just very briefly, there are two sort of, I think, opportunities here in London on the access to the internet front. One is what I mentioned before, that Transport for London is using its tunnels to lay full fibre right across the city, and we're going to connect that up to 600 public buildings. And a company is going to provide that on a concession from Transport for London for the next 20 years. Now, on a retail side, that's how people get 4G on the tube. But the more groundbreaking part of this is that we actually have that dark fibre network right across London that lowers the cost for other internet providers to come in and connect up those bits of London that are still sort of served by copper. So that's more competition, more choice, that should create a wider range of affordable offers for Londoners. So I think, like slightly philosophical, but actually it's something that's happening right now in London. And secondly, more immediately, is that all companies are introducing social tariffs. So a basic package for a Londoner would now cost between sort of £12 and £17, according to our analysis of the various companies, of which there are more on the marketplace. And there will be an agreement to waive the connection fee, so households can get something at relatively low cost. Now, this doesn't solve the problem that Daniel set out, that the connection can be on the pole and there can be a low cost offer, but for many people that will still be too much. So, but it goes some way towards addressing the problem that we know has existed for quite a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Theo. And Heather, anything from local authority perspective about collaboration?
Yeah, very quickly. Well, just to follow on the dark fibre point, because there are also opportunities to do that more locally, I think. So one of the things that we're doing is testing out the feasibility of laying dark fibre when we're doing housing improvement. So Greenwich has got quite a large housing stock, and obviously it's going into that housing stock very regularly. It's doing upgrade works, improvement works, it's doing electrical works. So we are laying dark fibre on some of our social housing blocks as part of those improvement works, and exploring the potential of kind of providers lighting up that dark fibre in the future, and that providing a more accessible or cheaper tariff to our residents. So yeah, that's just one example of something more locally. But I think more generally, I think to be effective in this area, I think it has to be cross-sectoral collaboration. I don't think you can do it any other way. This issue is so fundamental to the outcomes of residents. I think you have to work across council silos and sort of try and break down some of those barriers that we're currently in. Exactly how you do that, obviously it's easier said than done, but I think it has to be a cross-sector solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And I really love the idea of kind of building things into new developments, or, you know, when repairs are being carried out. That just makes so much sense, doesn't it? Well, I'm going to draw things to a close now because we're coming up to 5 o'clock. So I just really wanted to thank everybody. I want to thank our brilliant panel once again for their time and brilliant presentations. And I think, you know, some key themes throughout the sort of different perspectives around the fact that we all have a role to play, and we really need to kind of connect with each other, understand the baseline, and understand what already exists, so that we can address kind of issues with lack of data and understand the right actions to take. And real, you know, stuff around sharing knowledge. And it just seems, you know, there's people in this room, this digital room, and, you know, within our network and beyond, who can solve the issues that others have. And so there's just a need to sort of work together. For example, you know, with Charlie can tell you some of those people who are excluded, and that can help us better understand strategies to deal with that. So I think it's all around collaboration and communication. So yeah, thanks everybody for their participation, and thanks to Hatch for supporting the City Makers Forum. If you'd like to come to future events, sign up for our mailing list and keep an eye on our website for future events. And I just wanted to highlight, as part of a different programme, our Building Recovery Conference, which is on the 11th of November. It's our major conference for this year, and it focuses on how we address inequalities through the recovery phase. So it does kind of touch on some of the themes from today, and will really offer solutions and inspiration for us on how we tackle this next phase. So registration's open and it's been posted in the chat, and we'd love to see you all there in person in November. Thanks again to all of our panel and to you,